I think that I always tell people that it's important for them to realize that they don't have to speak as publicly as we have. Like, there was a reason that we spoke publicly the way that we did. It was because, in part, what I learned in 2020 from the experience of the gymnasts involved in the Nassar case is that it wasn't until there was one person, Rachel Den Hollander, it wasn't until she put a name and a face to that accusation that really things started happening to put a stop to Larry Nassar. And so we felt like we were in a position to do the same thing. And so at that time, there was a real purpose to us speaking with our names and faces. But at this point, I don't think that's necessary anymore. Other survivors and other survivor families can speak up and be part of this effort, and do so from a position of anonymity and still have what they're doing serve a really important and effective purpose. So I don't think people need to be at the point of feeling comfortable with being public in order to still really make a very, very important contribution to this process.
Do you think, I was talking to a mom of a boy for a while, I mean, not a young man who is a survivor, and she said that she feels like there's an added complexity to reporting as a male, especially when they're abused by a male perpetrator.
Absolutely.
And that she thinks that the problem is far more pervasive than people think in cheerleading. And I guess until I spoke with her about that, it hadn't occurred to me, and I wanted to ask you about your opinion on that.
I think that that is absolutely true. There have been a number of boys who have reached out to my sons, seeking support and seeking connection because they are also survivors of abuse. In some cases, they are victims of Jerry Harris. In other cases, they're victims of other perpetrators. But the reason that so many of those boys don't make reports is because they are not out to their parents or to their communities. And there really is no way for a minor to make a report of sexual abuse without involving their parents. And the process of a young person making a decision to come out to their family is something that is so intensely personal, and it is so important for that young person to be able to do that on their own terms and with their own chosen timing. And to have that coming out process be forced on a person because they've been the victim of sexual abuse is just absolutely tragic and awful. And so I think part of the reason why gay young men, just in general, and in the sport of all-star cheerleading specifically, have a special vulnerability to abuse is because the perpetrators of this abuse are aware that victims are less likely to speak out if they're not out to their parents and other people in their community. And so the victims are more likely to stay silent. As far as the pervasiveness of sexual abuse among boys involved in our all-star cheerleading, I think that it is very, very pervasive. A couple years ago in 2020, when we as a family were just sort of processing all of this, initially, I asked my sons about that. I asked them, like, So what percentage of boys in All-Star would you say have had some form of like, quote, creepiness, either from coaches or from adult athletes? And my sons actually laughed at that question. And they said, like basically virtually 100%. Certainly some of the boys have been subjected to much more extensive and much more persistent and much more severe abuse. But as far as, receiving unsolicited photos and videos, being asked for photos and videos, being subjected to physical touching that isn't wanted or invited, or physical interaction, even if it is, quote, consensual, which is not possible for an underage person to consent to anything, that it is extremely pervasive in the sport for boys.
Okay. That, and thinking about it, because it's such a tough topic for boys to address.
Yeah.
I mean, they're an easier target. They're less likely to come forward.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, it is a club that no one would choose to be a part of. But when women or girls speak up about having been victims or survivors of sexual abuse, they are sort of embraced by a community, sort of a sisterhood of survivors, that there's sort of a place for that in our culture, whereas there really is not a parallel community or parallel support system in place for male survivors of sexual abuse. It's a very isolating place to be as a boy or a young man.
How are they doing now?
I would describe my boys at this point as battered and bruised. I would say that they are still struggling a great deal. It takes time for the full impact of abuse to kind of unfold in a survivor's life. They have been in trauma therapy now for a couple of years. And so it's peeling back layers of an onion. Each new set of circumstances that arise in their lives, there's kind of a new facet of what they've been through that has to be addressed. Even positive things like, a new dating relationship in one of their lives. The very healthy, normal, age-appropriate relationship is eliciting a whole new facet of the trauma that needs to be processed and addressed in therapy, a whole new dimension to anxiety. So I think we are exhausted. We're sad. We're angry. We're still really struggling.
So you're in Charleston, and you mentioned that you were there as visiting Darkness to Light Foundation. Have you been working with them as part of the healing process?
Well, we really we want to make some meaning of what my sons have suffered. we want something good to come out of what they've been through. We're really at a point of sort of seeking purpose. And we're also wanting to sort of make a gradual pivot from a position of being survivors to being advocates. And so we are partnering with Darkness to Light in order to do that. Darkness to Light is a really outstanding organization that is doing really, really effective evidence-based work when it comes to the prevention of child sexual abuse.
I love their mission. I read it this past week because I've been using their site, as reference for a lot of my research, and their mission struck me to where they started because they realized there was nobody focusing on how to prevent child abuse. Child sexual abuse, everything was focused in the aftermath and picking up the pieces. And I thought that was amazing. Mm-hmm. How they framed it. I was very impressed when I was researching them.
Yeah, and their programs are, like I say, they're evidence informed, they're evidence based. They are involving a huge number of sort of nationally and world renowned experts in the materials that they create. And so that's what we want to be a part of. And the other part of their mission that really resonates with me, and I think is that the cheer community could benefit from a focus like this, is that Darkness to Light's belief is that the prevention of sexual abuse is the responsibility of adults. It is not the responsibility of children and young people. And one of my concerns about the way that USASF has responded to things to this point is that their focus has been on the young people when it comes to the prevention of abuse. A couple of years ago, when USASF put on this campaign of like the AAA challenge, like that, when athletes post photos on social media, that they need to be asking themselves, is this photo athletic? What is it amplifying? Is it age appropriate? Because the message being that, part of the reason for the sex abuse problem in this sport is because young people are posting inappropriate photos on social media. Like that's ridiculous. That prevention needs to fall on if we just make sure that kids post athletic and age-appropriate things that amplify the right message on social media, that we're going to fix this problem. This Safe at All Star organization that USASF has put forward as a solution, which is, that organization is problematic for a number of reasons, but the initial version of their website, at the banner at the top of the website, talked about how their most important mission is essentially, in essence, to train athletes to make good choices. That is a victim blaming message for us to say that the solution, like if we train athletes to make good choices, that therefore there's no longer going to be sex abuse in cheer. That is a thinly veiled victim blaming message. The responsibility for preventing abuse in cheerleading and in every other setting falls on the shoulders of the adults involved, not on kids.
Yeah. And they can blame social media all they want, but I've talked to a number of survivors who were abused far before the days of Facebook and Snapchat and
Yeah, exactly.
so
Yeah, no, the presence of those social media tools certainly makes it much more difficult for parents to keep their kids safe. You know, it creates a doorway into kids' lives that is problematic for sure, but the problem is not social media. Social media is just a tool. The problem is the culture in this sport and the tolerance that has existed to this point for sexual abuse in the sport.
I agree. So anything that I didn't touch on that you wanted to?
Let's see, I have a few notes. So specifically with regard to Safe at All Star, I now know, so back in 2020, when I went to the USASF website and there was a heading on the menu bar where it said Safe Sport, and I thought I was reporting to the US Center for Safe Sport. In fact, of course, I wasn't. All-Star cheerleading doesn't currently fall under the jurisdiction of the US Center for Safe Sport. But at the time, USASF was using that terminology because they had basically purchased training materials from the US Center for Safe Sport that they were using to kind of inform their approach. The USASF, since that time, has made like an organizational decision to go a different direction and create this Safe at All-Star organization, or endorse Safe at All-Star as kind of their partner organization when it comes to the prevention of sexual abuse, reporting of sexual abuse, that type of thing. Of course, as soon as I heard about Safe at All-Star, I looked into it. I visited their website. I looked at the team of people that they had hired. Quickly, it stood out to me that the individual who was involved in actually creating their athlete protection plan is a man named Rick Brashler. And he has been the director of safety and risk management at Kanakuk camps since 2003. I had some awareness of Kanakuk camps at that time as well. I had heard that there was a history of some very, very severe sexual abuse that had taken place at Kanakuk camps. And so that kind of piqued my concern. And so I started looking into it a little bit more. I found a website that is factsaboutkanakuk.com. They've done a really good job on that website of laying out a whole timeline of the abuse that has taken place at Kanakuk, the multiple perpetrators involved in that abuse, the way that abuse has been handled by Kanakuk camps, which has been to sort of bully survivors and their families into non-disclosure agreements. So all of this is stuff that took place under the guidance or leadership of Rick Brashler. I also found a video on the Facts About Kanakuk website of a deposition from one of the legal cases related to abuse there, where Rick Brashler was questioned about his credentials. And in that video, he talks about how he's a high school graduate. His formal education basically consists of Pizza Hut store manager training and a correspondence certificate in risk management. Like, these are not legitimate credentials. Like, compared to the kind of credentials that the experts that are being used by an organization like Darkness to Light, where people who are contributing to that program are people that have very extensive formal education in topics related to child safety, that is not the background that Rick Breschler has. And so I was so distressed, offended, very personally upset by the fact that USASF would put this program forward as their solution to the problem. I mean, it is offensive that they would believe that parents in this sport are not capable of using Google to check into who is involved in this and make an assessment of whether or not that this is a credible person, a credible program. The fact that they would put this forward as a solution is something that every parent in this sport should be offended by, in my belief.
I agree. Completely.
Yeah.
Where's your psychology degree?
Yeah. Where your psychology, criminal justice, child development. I mean, there are people with, a legitimate program is going to be informed by the expertise of many, many experts with a great deal of experience working on the basis of scientific evidence. And that is not what's happening with Safe at All-Star. I think that Safe at All-Star is just yet another instance of varsity/USASF being resistant to the notion of outside accountability. There are plenty of organizations that the entities in charge of this sport could bring in and contract with in order to create a program that is specific to all-star cheerleading. But by bringing in those outside experts, they are making themselves accountable to those outside experts, and I don't believe that that's something that they want to do.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
It's concerning. Yeah. We'll be touching on that very soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think of other things. Just on the topic of what I think, certainly there are plenty of days that I feel discouraged about the lack of change that has happened to this point. But I do think that there has been some change that has taken place over the past couple of years. It's not change that USASF or varsity has embraced or that they have pioneered, but it is change that has been forced on them. I think that we as a sport community owe a great deal to Marissa and Trisha and USA Today and their investigative reporting. When they started their process of investigation and before they published their first article in September of 2020, there were 21 individuals on the USASF banned list. There are now over 200. Many of those people are on that list because of the efforts of the USA Today investigative team. So I think that that's huge. That's very important. There has been, it's not something I have a whole lot of detail on, but USASF has contracted with TNG in order to reopen a number of previously closed reports that have been made to USASF, and I've spoken to a few people that have been contacted by TNG as part of reopening some of those cases, and those people have been impressed by the diligence of the TNG investigators. I think it's an open question how USASF will actually handle any information that is provided to them by TNG, but maybe at least there's some additional information being gathered about some of those cases. There are some gyms, like, to their credit, Cheer Athletics, of course, was one of the defendants in our civil suit. To their credit, I am told that Cheer Athletics has adopted some measures that go way over and above what USASF requires when it comes to their human resources, their staff and coach training, that type of thing. So we've seen the emergence of organizations like the Sports Compliance Company, where they're providing some of these tools for gyms in order to be more diligent about checking into the background of their employees and overseeing their employees and handling reports when they come in and that type of thing. And so again, that's not coming from USASF or from varsity, but it's a change that's taken place over the past couple of years that I think advances the interest of athletes and families in the sport. So that's good. And the other thing is that just ice has been broken on holding USASF and varsity accountable in the civil legal process. I think that when our family made the decision to file civil suit against varsity and USASF, it was maybe because we were fairly new to the sport and we hadn't quite been groomed into the degree of intimidation and compliance that I think a lot of families feel with regard to USASF and varsity. I can't count the number of people over the past couple of years that have expressed just disbelief that we would dare to do that, just because people in this sport understand the stranglehold that varsity has on the sport, and they are worried about speaking up, and they're worried about the consequences of speaking up, not just for their own child, but for their child's team and their child's gym. And I think we naively perhaps didn't quite understand the degree of varsity's power when we spoke up when we did, but at least kind of that path has been paved for other families to follow.
Right. I mean, I was looking at Rockstar Greenville, and I mean, the gym shut down. Those athletes had already paid for their uniforms, their initial competition fees, and to my knowledge, they haven't been reimbursed, and they were scrambling to find a new home if they wanted to continue cheerleading. Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, there was no effort from varsity or USASF to say, hey, let us help you.
Right.
And I was discouraged by that. I was not surprised, but very discouraged.
Yeah. Other things that I think need to happen, there's been a lot of kind of conversation about, well, background checks and, regulating who's able to be in the, warm-up area at competition and that type of thing. Those kinds of measures, while they are necessary and they are important, I don't think that they're going to fix the problem, because in a lot of cases, in the case of Jerry Harris, in the case of the coach that assaulted my sons, in the case of Scott Foster, a lot of these other people, you can do a background check, and just because somebody doesn't have something on their criminal background does not mean that they're not a perpetrator of abuse.
Right.
As far as other changes that need to happen, I think that we as a sport, we have a very pervasive cultural problem. I think that certainly I absolutely understand that talking about sexual abuse of minors is very difficult. It involves some really uncomfortable conversations. But I think it's really important that the adults involved in this sport, and this includes parents, coaches, gym owners, all of the adults involved, really, really understand that what we're talking about is the type of abuse that has a huge and lifelong impact on these athletes. This is not a small thing that these athletes have suffered. This is a sort of abuse that results in suicidality, that results in self-harm behaviors, that results in kids getting, what I've seen in my own son's lives. My sons went from being extremely academically successful and on a academic trajectory that would result in, easy admission to college and, all of the professional, future consequences of that, to really struggling a great deal academically and the impact that that's going to have on their future. This is abuse that will affect these kids for the rest of their lives. It is not something to take lightly. It's not something for people to roll their eyes about. There still is a little bit, it may be at this point a shrinking contingent, but there still are people in the sport that have this attitude that what's happening is not all that big of a deal, and that these kids are just being overly sensitive about what they've experienced. And so I think as long as there are people that are holding that attitude, that we're going to still have a problem. In July of this year, when Jerry Harris was sentenced in his criminal case, there were 75 adults, including a number of very prominent members of the cheerleading community, who chose to make videos or write letters in support of Jerry Harris in that sentencing process, which was devastating to our family. It creates a situation where it's all that much harder for other victims to stand up and to report when they see that even in a case like ours, where this is a person who admitted to what my sons alleged that he did. This is a person who pled guilty to these crimes. He's being sentenced for these crimes, and that these people are still expressing support for him is really problematic. My attitude is that, yes, I understand that there are people who you are so close with that you will continue to have some degree of affection for them. You still continue to wish them well and pray for them and all of those kinds of things. So I guess I don't have an issue with people continuing to have some sort of personal relationship with Jerry Harris. I don't need everybody to hate him. I don't hate Jerry Harris. But it's a different thing to stand up and lend your voice in a federal court proceeding to support a person who is being sentenced for a crime against minors. And so the fact that many prominent members of the cheer community did that and have not faced significant repercussions from the community, I think is a problem. It's an indication of the cultural issue that still exists in this sport. I've already mentioned that the prevention efforts need to be directed at adults as opposed to kids. It's not the responsibility of kids to keep themselves safe from abuse. It is the responsibility of coaches and adult athletes and gym owners, and to the extent that they're allowed to be aware of what's going on, also parents, but it is not the responsibility of athletes, minor athletes, to keep themselves safe.
That's the least we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in addition to a cultural problem, we have an accountability problem at this point. Like, the thing that I've been calling for from the very start is transparency and accountability, and that's not something that has happened yet. We need the entities in charge of this sport to be accountable to some sort of outside organization, some sort of outside oversight. Again, ideally, if we can get under the jurisdiction of U.S. Center for Safe Sport, then all of a sudden we have some accountability actually even imposed by Congress. That's the kind of position that we need to be in. Right now, USASF and varsity are really not accountable to anyone except for themselves. And that's creates a dangerous situation for athletes in this sport.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever, and I've been come across a sport that's so heavily entwined with a for-profit company. It is bizarre.
It is, yeah. And having spoken to parents of other survivors in other sports, when I explained that part of the dynamic in cheerleading to them, they are just aghast that is the situation that we face in cheerleading. You know, certainly other sports have their own special and unique vulnerabilities to abuse, but the enmeshment that USASF has with varsity is certainly a unique dynamic that is not in the interest of the safety of athletes in this sport at all. You know, the other thing that I'd like to see happen eventually is some sort of kind of assessment of, you know, bringing in an outside agency to do some study of the existing dynamics that exist in the sport, to look at historically and in the present, like what are the patterns related to the culture in this sport, the structures, the policies, the practices in the sport that impact on athlete safety. You know, doing some cultural assessment of the sport where they look at the, you know, do parents, do athletes, do coaches, do gym owners feel free and able to report concerns? You know, what are the dynamics that exist in sort of coaching practices that are common in this sport? Are there whistleblower protections in place? You know, that kind of an assessment, I think, would be really helpful in order to be able to identify some of the patterns that I'm sure that you're hearing from other parents and other people, that yes, people are in different gyms at different competitions with different experiences, but there's like the broad brushstrokes of the concerns that people have, the dynamics that are keeping people quiet, I think are similar. And, you know, if there could be some sort of outside assessment of those dynamics, of that culture, of those organizational, you know, those structural dynamics, and then that organization that is doing the assessment could give some recommendations about changes that could be made, and then some sort of outside accountability over coming years, so that we as parents in this sport could make a informed assessment about whether or not change is actually happening in a meaningful way. Because you know, we as parents, we should not trust the existing you know, oversight that's in place, and there should be a long process that's required to reestablish trust with parents. However we move forward, it's not something that should just be given just because varsity and USASF say, oh, well, we have Safe at All-Star and they have this snazzy app and they're doing this video training, like everything's fine now. Like that should not be adequate to satisfy us that everything is in fact fine and that there are meaningful protections in place at this point.
Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day and how I absolutely have no trust in the organizations overseeing cheerleading at all.
For sure.
I mean, my daughter's a junior. She's still cheerleading. But I'm not comfortable with what's, with the bodies governing it, which is concerning.
Absolutely.
And there's no other options. Like, if you want to cheer, this is it.
Yep.
These are your options.
Yep. And I think that as tragic as it is that there are all these new cases coming out, that I would hope that parents would look at all of these other cases and see that this happens to boys, it happens to girls, it happens to 12-year-olds, it happens to 17-year-olds, it happens, like there's no population group of athletes who are immune to this kind of abuse. The fact that you are an involved parent, a parent that's paying attention, a parent that goes to competitions, who gets to know your child's teammates, who gets to know your child's teammates' parents, who knows your child's coaches, like being present and involved and paying attention is not 100% safeguard either. I was an involved, diligent, concerned parent as well. And this happened to my sons, not just once, but twice. So, I've over the past couple of years, there have been a lot of parents who have attacked me on the grounds that there must have been something wrong with my parenting in order for this to have happened to my sons. I must have been an absent parent or a negligent parent or a parent that just sort of like dropped her kids off at cheer practice or at competitions and didn't pay any attention from there. And that is just absolutely not the case. And so parents need to get that your kid is at risk, regardless of the particulars of your situation, as long as the current systems remain in place, unfortunately.
Yeah, I feel like that's something I want to scream from the rooftop. No, these were not all single parent households. These were not parents who just dropped their kids off at practice at 9 a.m. These were not parents who didn't go to competitions with their kids. These were you. These were me. Mm-hmm. These parents were the same as us.
Yep.
And it happened to their kids. So don't fool yourself into thinking that being involved is going to prevent this.
Yeah, or that it couldn't possibly happen to my kid, so therefore this concern is not relevant to my family.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
Amen. Are the boys still cheerleading?
They are. So in September of 2020, we were still at our first gym. The owner of the gym and my son's coaches were aware that the boys were victims of Jerry Harris and of this other coach. But when they found out that we intended to speak publicly about what had happened, the coach of my son Sam's team quit in protest. He threw a big fit about the fact that he disagreed with our decision to speak publicly about this and quit his position as coach of my son's team, left the gym. we were clear with the owner of the gym at that time that we didn't expect any sort of special treatment from the gym. We didn't want to force anybody to make a choice between us and this coach. And so if we needed to, we were willing to leave that gym community if she wanted us to do that. And she, at that time, expressed support for us, told us that she was on our side. And we made it clear that going forward, we would not agree to disagree with this particular coach. If this coach was going to oppose our effort to speak out publicly about what happened to the boys, that's not something that we were willing to just live with. And she agreed with us and kind of vowed to support the boys. Which went okay for a couple of months, but then eventually that coach started showing up again at practice and at competitions, which is something that was really deeply upsetting to the boys because, that was in their very early phases of speaking out about this. And to have to exist sort of under the authority of a coach who has been vocal about the fact that he doesn't support your efforts to speak up about what's happened to you. I mean, that's a legitimate concern on my boy's part. And so when the gym owner essentially refused to keep this particular coach from being backstage at competitions and things like that, then we made a decision to leave that gym. That was a really, really difficult thing for my sons to do. That gym community was their community during a time that they really very much needed a supportive community. But by the same token, it was just so triggering for them to be in a situation where this guy kept showing up, that they didn't feel like they could continue with that. And so we left our first gym. Unfortunately, we had to do that before the end of the season, which resulted in my son Sam not being able to compete at Worlds, some things like that. It was a huge loss for them to leave that community. Eventually, we moved to a new gym, and fortunately, we have found that to be a very supportive community. My boys love all-star cheerleading, and they have lost a lot as a result of having spoken up about what happened to them. And they really, really do not want to lose cheer as well. There have been a lot of days over the past couple of years that cheer is the one thing that keeps them getting out of bed and emerging from their bedrooms in the midst of their depression and their anxiety. And so it's still an important part of our lives. But it still is very, very difficult for them to go into this setting where they were abused. Going to competitions has been extremely anxiety-provoking for them at times. There has been less so now than there was a couple of years ago, but there's a lot of whispering and finger pointing and people that won't ride on the same elevator with us and that kind of thing, unfortunately. But we have stuck it out because cheer is important to my sons. I absolutely am available to parents of survivors who have either started the process of reporting or are considering starting that process. Through our whole experience, I felt really isolated and really lonely and not really having anybody to look to as a source of information or wisdom or support. But I absolutely would offer myself as a shoulder to cry on, or as a person that might be able to offer some wisdom or insight now at this point, having been through start to finish one criminal case and one civil case. If parents feel like they would benefit from that support. Probably Twitter is the best way to get in touch with me. My username on Twitter is _Kristen Erica _. I'm the twins' mom on Twitter, and so my DMs on Twitter are open, and so people can reach me there if they'd like to.